Alright, so I wanted to do a little bit of a review for you guys because I did just start messing around with some new materials, and I said I was going to test them out and play with them, so here's what I got. This new material is a neoprene casting rubber from Creature Cast, and I started playing with two different, there's a few different thicknesses and hardnesses ranging from super flex to rigid. But I got the Superflex and I got the semi-rigid. And what is nice about them is that you can actually cast them out of a plaster mold, and it's basically casting similar to latex. It's a slush cast and it air dries. So I started out with the semi-rigid. And the semi-rigid is actually a pretty nice consistency. It's a little bit it's a little bit thinner than like a latex feel, but it's actually a pretty good consistency. And what I wanted to do was test it out with different types of molds, because according to the manufacturer, it's supposed to dwell, dwell for, I think, 4 to 6 hours depending on the type of mold material. The only thing is that I always cast it up a little bit differently depending, especially with latex. I've always done things differently because, first off, it depends on the mold, so not all molds you're going to be able to let it dwell the same way, and as well as I started noticing things when I was casting up latex that sometimes when you got a lot of flashing around the bottom of the neck and things like that, it came out just as thick or thicker sometimes than most of the mask, to where it was actually dwelling. And I also got, it also helped to have some tips from other artists that did a little bit thicker masks, like Pete Infelice really helped me out with that from the Devil's Workshop, and he was talking about how he gets his so thick and he just builds it up with layers. So my system with latex has always been, I'll let it dwell for about an hour to an hour and a half, and then I'll pour it out, let it start to gel and start to set up for a couple hours, and then I'll do another pour and let it dwell for about an hour, hour and a half, and then dump it out. And I'll do it that way. And that's how I would build thicknesses. So what I wanted to do was apply that same idea to this. Like I said, one was because not all molds you're going to be able to let it dwell. So here's kind of an undercoat face mask that I made for my niece for she was Deadpool a couple years ago, or last year, I think, last year or the year before. The thing is that the mold for this, if you just let it dwell, I can fill up the mold that'll fill up the nose and the top of the forehead, but I can't fill it up any higher than that, or else it'll start pouring out of the sides, out of the bottom. So I was going to have to, so if I have any molds like that in the future, I'm going to have to figure out a way to do it. So I started playing around, and here's what I actually got. This one was just a quick one, just letting it go for an hour, and it's still pretty, it has a little bit of hardness to it, but it's still pretty soft. This one turned out pretty good. I did 3 layers of this one, kind of letting it gel for about an hour to an hour and a half, or letting it dwell, and then pouring it out, letting it dry for a little bit, and then doing it again. But this material is actually pretty nice because it's really solid, but it still has like a little bit of flex to it. And to further along with that, what's really nice about the material and the idea is that you can cast something that's hard and rigid, but not have to make a silicone mold. You'll be able to do it out of a plaster mold, which everyone that uses silicone knows that'll save them some money. And it's slush cast, so it's a lot easier. You don't have to do a mixing of the resins, of the resin. And the other thing is that with resin, since it's a 2-part mix and it's and that's how it has to set, you're going to get like there's always going to be an area to where it's going to be thicker or thinner in other areas, or it's going to set up in one spot and clump up. And there's not as much of an issue with this. So I wanted to take it farther, and I created this guy out of the same stuff, the rigid material. So as you can see, it's still it's actually pretty good and solid. It's still slightly flexible, but it's actually it has a really nice solid feel to it. The reason I wanted to do this is because you can look at this thing and it has some serious undercuts for just the back half. You know, it's underneath the pumpkin over mask that he's wearing. It has some deep undercuts here and a little bit under here. For the face, you know, not only going behind the cheekbones, but it actually cuts in because that's where the pumpkin mask ends. It's got this long lower jaw, the long tongue. The stem to the pumpkin is in the front half of the mold, so that had to get pulled out. So it did take a good few minutes. I'm going to say probably like 4 or 5 minutes just trying to pull it out of the mold to make sure that it was able to kind of come out. But after I got it out and let it set, and it's still hardening, I think it's a really good material for that. And it's so nice to be able to really just cast that up just like you would latex in like a slush setting. Alright. Now, the other one that I got is the Super Flex from Creature Cast. And with that, the first one I did, as you can see, is really thin. And the issue with it was that I was doing it just with the material, and I didn't get the thickener. It didn't come in yet. The Super Flex, if you use it just straight, it's a really thin, I'm going to say almost like watery type of thickness. At least that's what I see it as. So I definitely added some thickeners, and you can add, this thickener works for all of their stuff. So you can use it for the Super Flex. I could have used it for the rigid, the semi-rigid if I wanted to. But the semi-rigid I think works great just by itself. This one I had to definitely add the thickener to it. However, just with the first test, what I did notice and why I want to show you guys is that there was definitely some really thin areas. Here you can see on the neck area, it's extremely thin and you can see through it. However, even with that, like, you can see how far that thing stretches, and it's still, it hasn't tore. Whoops, tore right there. Stretched it too far on that one. But some of these other thin areas, it's got a really strong pull to it. So, you know, not only was I able to actually pull it out, even though it had this thin layer, but it has a pretty good tear strength on it. Now, when I thickened it up and actually did it right with a few different layers and let it dwell for a little bit, I got this, which is almost similar to it's extremely similar to latex. You know, it's still got a pretty good flex to it and hasn't torn. But, you know, this is supposed to be a lot better with accepting paints and things like that, according to, you know, when I was talking to him. So it's definitely a nice material to kind of play around with and use. The rubber, the Superflex, it doesn't dry as quick as the latex does. It does take a little bit of extra time that I noticed. It also is going to take a little bit more time to build it up, so you got to let it dwell for a little bit longer or do a few more layers than you normally would with latex. However, I do think it is a nice alternative because you're going to have those people that can't do latex because they're allergic, or kids, or things like that. You're also going to have so I mean that's one nice thing. It's also it's not toxic, non-toxic. So, you know, you don't have the ammonia smell and everything from latex. It does have its own smell that can get to you, but do it in a well ventilated area. But I mean, I'm pretty happy with the results of what came out. So testing it out was pretty fun, and I'm going to keep messing around with it to see what I can create. But the rubber, so honestly, the rubber is, I actually think is pretty nice. Just make sure that you mix up a bucket and do like a thicker batch when you're casting for the Superflex. Mix in some thickener, that way you can get it to more of a latex-like consistency instead of the watery consistency. But the semi-rigid is definitely amazing, and the greatest thing that's really nice about this is that I can come up with something like this that's hard, a nice, I mean, look at that, just grabbing it by that little spot and it holds its shape. I can cast up something that's rigid and solid out of a plaster mold instead of having to spend the money and spend the time to make a silicone mold. So that's what I got for you guys. I'm happy with the way that these things turned out, and I'm going to keep kind of playing around with them, but I want to show you guys what I came up with. So I'll check you guys out on another one, and thanks for watching, guys.